Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Neurotech.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Maurits Ortmanns, and he is at the University of Ulm in Germany, and was a recommendation from a previous guest. And so I guess you've been doing some stuff in the neurotech field, and I'm pretty excited about this episode, as we were just talking about off air, because this is going to be the first time we were talking about electronics design and how to make the chips that integrate or understand the signals coming from electrodes and the implants and everything like this. So do you want to introduce yourself better than I just did?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laden, for having me. Yeah, it's a pleasure basically being here and, being the first to talk about integrated circuits for neurotech. Like, I'm myself an electrical engineer, graduated many years back, like it's more than 2 decades back that I basically graduated back at the University in Freiburg, southern Germany, in microsystems technology. But I've been doing integrated circuits basically then for all my life long. And integrated circuit is basically the field of electrical engineering where we put transistors, as to speak, active analog and digital circuits on an extreme miniature scale. So nowadays we talk about microelectronics, but in fact we're actually doing nanoelectronics because most of the devices which we use are really in the nanometer scale. So by that we basically can place hundreds, thousands, or even millions of individual active devices like transistors on these solid state electronics. Most of my group actually does so-called CMOS, like CMOS is complementary metal on silicon transistors, and that's basically like what we are doing. So our application range is typically found at the interface between something. So therefore I'm calling it interface circuits or interface electronics. And like what we have been mostly doing is interfacing analog and digital world. So any natural signal, from sensors and so on, and translating them into the world of digital signal processing. And then basically also almost 20 years back, I started a field which was then interfacing bio together with electronics. And how did I come there? And that's the last part of the introduction. I basically just started my first job in industry right after graduation. And then I was being asked to join a team in the company which was basically selected to design an implant circuit for a company intending to build a retinal implant, like an epiretinal stimulator. Nobody wanted the job. I said, well, I heard something about it. So all of a sudden I was technical lead, and that was great 2 years because I actually could lead my first design team, and we could come up with real cool ideas for a neurostimulator for epiretinal implants. Then I never stopped. So I kept on doing that for the last couple of years.
Well, so what is integrated circuit design? I mean, this is basically the TSMC and Intel chips and all this kind of stuff, right? That they're doing, breaking the laws of physics, essentially, getting past, limits that we thought were unbreakable and getting down to basically the atomic scale. So is this what you guys are doing too? Similar to Taiwan Semiconductor and
Yeah.
Contracting with them or something like that?
So there is in our business, there's basically 2 major fields. One is the manufacturer, like you just mentioned, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. That's what TSMC is. They have basically been famous for producing microelectronics chips, but not necessary for the design. Of course, these companies also have their own design teams and actually do chip design. And then there are the fabless designs of the fabless design companies, where you basically have design teams doing the blueprints of a design of electronics, but then still have it being manufactured, for example, at TSMC. Like a company like Intel has both. They have big chip design and own manufacturing capabilities. Also, other companies have that. And we at the university, we are basically fabless, because these fabs nowadays, like in the modern design nodes, they cost billions actually to produce and also to maintain. That's really huge investments currently going on also around the world. So we really do the blueprints. So we invent new electronics, invent new architectures, do so-called application-specific integrated circuits. That's what we call an ASIC. But once we have the blueprint of that, it's basically just a file which we send over to the manufacturing house. They produce it, and then it takes a couple of months and you get your chips back. So that's basically the design cycle which we have. It's actually long-term, because like until you really get experiments being done, you really have to wait almost for a year between You have some idea, you build something, and then you get it manufactured, you get it back. A year to 2 years is very typical for basically a PhD student or for an average designer.
Wow. Yeah, and then those are billion-dollar fabs, and then they're out of they're not up to date anymore within a few years. So that's another thing that they're constantly updating that. But so yeah, it doesn't sound like it's a very fun job to be a PhD student if you're, sitting on your hands for a year waiting for somebody to finish their side. But yeah.
But I would a little bit agree and a little bit contradict, like I like doing hardware. The problem with hardware is if it comes back and it doesn't work, you're of course disappointed. Software is way more, how should I say, it's easier, you switch off your computer in the night, you switch it on next morning. Sometimes with measurements, you simply can't do that. Don't speak about animal experiments, you even need to feed your experiment, right? But in our case, the same thing. It is extremely satisfactory when you have hardware being realized and it's your application-specific design, it's your baby. And then when it really does what it's supposed to do, so you can basically reproduce simulation results in the lab, it's extremely satisfactory. So a PhD student achieving that, they are very happy. The ones who don't, very rarely, also this happens, of course, they are not so happy. But then you also mentioned a very important point. In this neurotech, we don't use the latest so-called technology nodes of the semiconductor manufacturers. Why? Because we don't need to have these extreme fine line CMOS chips, like just saying a few applications, computer processors or graphic card processors, or these inference accelerators for neural networks. This needs to be extremely powerful, very mighty, smallest transistors, highest speed, lowest power. For neurotech, we are typically working in rather old technologies. So neither the manufacturing is too expensive nor the fabs. Like we are still not talking about, a pocket full of money, but it's not billion level. And very often we also need to have these old technology nodes simply because the newest technology nodes do not supply enough voltage. And especially when you want to stimulate somehow for a functional electrical stimulator, you simply need to have more voltage compliance as these modern technologies would offer you. They are typically below a volt. A volt you just put to your hand and you don't even feel it. So there is not much stimulation about that. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely with the larger traces and resolution, everything like this, you also have more gaps, and so you can drive the higher voltage.
Exactly.
So do you want to describe ASICs? Why are they used in neurotech? What does a typical ASIC look like? What's a typical function?
Good. So ASIC is always coming into play when you need a certain specific integrated circuit just for one need. And when I'm teaching my students, I'm saying it is not typically the best thing to do because building an ASIC has a very large, we call that non-recurrent cost. And that does mean before you basically get the first handful of devices to test, to sell, to basically market, you need to put in a lot of money. So it's just the design time, but it's the engineering cost. It's then basically the production cost, all this non-recurring cost, which you basically have to put in until you get the very first design out. So therefore, ASICs are typically built for, let's say, like anyhow, integrated circuit, when you have a very large market, when you want to sell millions and hundreds of millions of devices, computer chips, smartphone chips, and stuff like that. There are a few exceptions where you would say, no, I need an ASIC just for my application. I'd say one of them might be if you send up a Mars rover, and you just need to have this one experiment with electronics, and you simply don't have the capacity for load and the capacity for volume to just send huge bulky electronics up there. So perhaps then you basically go for one ASIC and you say, no matter if it costs 5 or 6 million, we just need it. And the second example, and that's a very natural one, is implants, because like just imagine a retinal implant, you basically want to have electronics within an eyeball. How the heck can I basically take off-the-shelf electronics, build a PCB board, and then put it in there? It will simply not fit. Like in the chest, there is more space. Even around the brain, you could say there is more space, but the retinal implant is a classic. But basically, most of these applications then really require ASICs, also cardiac pacemakers nowadays, because you can make them lightweight, you can make them extremely low power because you don't have these huge energy sources, especially when you're not cabled. And you can simply do exactly what the electronics are supposed to do. You talked about stimulation. So then I'm building myself a stimulator. We talk about, for example, neural signal acquisition. I want to have perhaps some signal processing going on before digitization, some compression before wireless sending them. So I can just implement exactly what's needed to the lowest available cost, but cost in this term as volume and power, definitely not in terms of dollar signs, right? There it's becoming very expensive. Yeah. And that's basically the application range of ASICs then, yeah.
Yeah, so how does that work? I mean, if you're making, let's say,
Mhm.
hundreds of ASICs and you have that $5 million upfront cost, does it just get divided? Is it, thousands of dollars per ASIC essentially for those retinal
Yeah.
implant cases?
Absolutely. So if you just need to have that one device, the Mars rover is my typical example. You just have that one rover. You just need that one chip. No matter what the production cost is, at the end of the day, that one chip costs whatever basically the development time and manufacturing was. If you, for example, go for a neural implant, let's say you are building a prototype for the very first retinal implant, and later on the system simply fails, then what the whole development cost was one ASIC, you implant it, you find out it's not even working, and it's all done. The moment you find out, oh, wait a second, now it's full for a clinical trial, with 10 patients, I can do it. All of a sudden, you can use 10 or 20 of your ASICs, and the cost is divided down. The moment you can say, well, that ASIC is actually so powerful and my application works fine, I can now implant it into 1 million patients. Each ASIC is very low in cost because now you basically take the whole cost of the development time divided by 1 million, because the actual production costs very little. It is the development time until the first chips basically run out of the wafer fab. That's where most of the cost is going into in this manufacturing.
Okay. So what are typical functions of an ASIC? I mean, obviously stimulation, recording, maybe some kind of Bluetooth transmission. What are some
Mhm.
other things? And then maybe what's easy and what's hard?
Good point. So it of course totally depends on what you want to do. But the moment you go into the body, typically you at least want to have some kind of power ring, because otherwise it's not an active medical implant, right? So it needs to be active. So you need to have some kind of energy source. The easiest is a battery. Take, standard, especially old school cardiac pacemakers, battery, 10-year lifetime working. The moment you have either not the possibility to implant a big battery, take again the retinal implant, or like you simply want to have longer lifetime, or the power consumption of the system is so high that the battery would simply die far before the lifetime of the implant. So meaning the power consumption of the whole application is too high, then you need to have some wireless power transfer. That's one issue definitely. And one of the biggest problems still is until today communication, because what is an active implant somehow in the body if you basically can't communicate with it? So if it is supposed to stimulate something, you want to tell it, or you want to basically read some diagnosis data, then you need to read it. So in this bidirectional interface link, that is typically a very power hungry affair. There are still researchers around the world, and many companies also have their own, how should I say, their own favorite. And it totally depends on what data rates you need to communicate. But of course, there is RF. You talked about Bluetooth. Yes, you can do Bluetooth. There is infrared links. There is capacitive links, load shift keying links, for example, with when you just take an inductive link for energy, you can use the same link for low speed data transfer. But especially when it comes to multi-channel, and with multi, I mean hundreds or thousands of channel of neural recording, the data rates easily go into the megabit, into the almost 100 megabit rates. And that is very tough. And at that point, typically the power consumption for this transfer is orders of magnitude higher than all the other electronics. So basically generating this data on the ASIC is way more power efficient than actually transferring that data somehow outside. Yeah, and typically most of these applications still have an external operator somehow in the loop, so it's not everything implanted. There are of course applications where that's not the case, but for these multi-channel neural recorders, you still want to transmit, and that's why many experiments are still with people having their hats, having cables running around their neck, right? Like really going transcutaneous with cables, just because the data rates are so high.
Yeah. It's a crazy amounts of power, and then the batteries you need to power something like that long term is also insane. So why does it take so much development time? Why don't you have like templates or something like this? Like, oh, I need, the infrared module. Okay, boom. I take that from the library, or maybe an AI could help, put these together or something like this. I do know that, TSMC and stuff like this, they have the transistors, and even I heard something like they're not the most efficient design, like space-wise, but maybe they're 18% bigger than they should be. But because they're more modular in that way, and you can literally just fit in, 1,000 or something like, or 10,000, and be able to build it like this. So yeah, do you guys use libraries, or and to what extent?
So there are, of course, libraries. Like libraries, as you just said, there is, first of all, libraries just for the what the single elements are. Like we call these the primitives. The primitives is, as the name says, the smallest function unit, a resistor, a capacitor, a one transistor. But now putting that together to a circuit is actually what a circuit designer does. So you basically take hundreds and thousands of these primitives, and then you basically build more complex circuits out of that. There is almost no template, or I should say, like just a library where you say, oh, give me this amplifier and give me that stimulator. This is really not existent, at least not on a larger scale. In a lab, doing it for 10 or 20 years, of course, you have that lying around. So you basically try to reuse prior implementation of IP. This is partially different for digital circuitry. There you have, let's say, larger, complex IP blocks, which you actually can use. But in the analog domain, when it really comes to the processing, amplification, filtering, manipulation of analog signals, that's where there is a lot of handwork still happening. But just in the example basically of my group's work, so for example, you mentioned the company we have been collaborating with for a few years, like they were intending to build a neuromodulator. So we started basically just with a neuro recorder in the very first place and built that, realized that, the company being happy having that as an ASIC, exactly with the specification they wanted. But we reused exactly the same circuit blocks in follow-up iterations when we basically combined that with stimulators. And all of a sudden I had a neuromodulator, right? I only had to design the stimulator, put everything together again. So and then it's more like a puzzle work. So you have individual blocks already, and now you basically need to fit them together into a new functionality. And of course, that's accelerating design time, because we don't throw everything away and just start everything from scratch, but we try to reuse as much as possible. On the academic side, yourself being a PhD student, you know what I'm talking about. Like if you don't kind of invent stuff, true, like how are you going to publish that at the end of the day? So this sometimes makes it difficult in just reusing things and just basically adding the little delta to now make it a cool system, but then the level of innovation is very little. And that's one of the reasons why, like I and my colleagues and, effectively many researchers around the world in different disciplines, of course, always try to come up with something new. And sometimes the work lacks to really prove that the new stuff is actually better than everything being around. So, and then it comes to, like the moment you want to do business, you really need to find the one technology which you find most convincing. Then you realize that, and you basically bring that into, into your system, and then you're also good. But like we constantly try to identify shortcomings, problems in the state of the art, and of course innovate on the circuit level to do that better. Perhaps do that for the very first time because nobody achieved that before. Things like that, yeah. But yeah, we reuse and
but it does sound like the libraries, the reuse is mostly from your own, institution or group or something like this, and that you rarely go outside, look at a paper, for example, and be like, oh, that's a cool, whatever, and you pull that.
Oh, that of course we do a lot. Like I would say the whole science field is always what's out there as good as possible, and then you try to merge and basically innovate by bringing most of the state of the art together, fitting best together, and then adding perhaps the last 10% of innovation in making work. So of course we look around. The only thing what you don't have is you open up a paper and say, wow, that's a great system for a neurostimulator, right? But you can't go buy it. You can't go, to Radio Shack and say, like, I'd like to have this neuromodulator over here or this ASIC. Perhaps if you have a friendly relationship with the other research team, they would basically have you participate. They send you a few samples. But just because somebody published something does not mean that you now have a library where you simply basically take the same design and just copy it over. You look at it, you say, okay, this is how I understand it. They never tell you the real details, like where the real tricks are. They just show, this is how it's supposed to work, and then you kind of understand. But if you want to use that from the state of the art, you sit down and basically build it yourself. It's like a process, you work in this, in manufacturing. Just somebody telling you they can encapsulate for 2 years lifetime does not mean by just reading the paper you have the same result within the next day.
Yeah, either intentionally or unintentionally, they leave something out.
Absolutely.
So, to what extent is this stuff modular? I mean, I know processors like in CPUs and stuff like this, they let's say you have an 8 core, processor. They actually they find the 8 cores that work the best or something like this, and they put those all together into one chip, and therefore it's not like one solid piece of chip or something like this. So do you guys do stuff like this where you build together, maybe you put together, I don't know, 10 ASICs or something like this, and how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. Like, I would even claim that all these years back when I did my first retinal implant, we were one of the first groups basically starting so-called, like what we call it back then, checkerboard arrays. So saying I have independent stimulation recording of functional units, and I can simply basically extend them in 2 dimensions. I can build a 5x5, 10x10, or 50x50 array. Then there is basically global functions communicating with those. This has huge advantages because it's super flexible, right? But then there is, of course, a limitation, which is the maximum size which you possibly can do is always being limited by something. It is limited by the communication speed. It's limited by the maximum power you can consume, by the data you can process. So making a design large intentionally in such a checkerboard array, and you say that's the capacity we can do. Somebody saying, but I only need half of that. That roughly reduces power and area by a factor 2. Functionality, number of electrodes, number of channels by factor 2. That's easy, but just saying, oh, I have that chip, please make it 100 times larger, that's not possible, right? We have also built similar things where, like a bus structure, you have, for example, this also in automotive electronics, where you have centralized processes and then sensors simply sit on a 2-wire bus and communicate everything, basically understands when am I allowed to speak to that bus and basically deliver my data or get data. We do similar things also for neurotech, where we say like we have an array of individual little solid ASICs of these little chips, but we can distribute them to individual places, and then they are all being communicating over a small amount of wires, which are, for example, encapsulated in a polyimide substrate or something. And then this is also very flexible, very powerful, because you can have 2, you can have 20, you can have 200 of those. But again, there is always an upper limit because some of the specs can simply not basically go to infinity, of course, and bandwidth and power consumption is typically 2 of the most important ones. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what is the breakdown of, I mean, you said it takes about a year. What is the timeline for each of these sections? I mean, you have the design, you have the fabrication, and then I guess testing or something like this, or what other parts and how long do each one of those take?
Good point. So back then, when I was designing this epiretinal implant, I could lead a design team which had a constant headcount of 5 engineers, which in a peak time was almost going up to 10 engineers basically working on individual tasks. And we were able to basically bring this all to run within, roughly speaking, 1.5 years. So many people basically working on the same thing. Of course, like it's not scaling linearly. You can't say, and when I bring 100 people in, it's going to be still a factor 10 faster. That's not happening. But of course, we could accelerate things because there was headcount and there was money around. In the university, for a similar development, you would say you easily need with, what do you have? We count not in engineers, but in PhD students. You would say it takes you perhaps 5 years to come up with the same thing. At the same time, in industry, you don't have the, how should I say, the pressure to publish at one point. So if you innovate or not, like, doesn't matter. You open up papers, you read, and you only basically bring in new stuff where the state of the art does not solve your problem. In the university, you basically try to innovate at every corner. So that's also sometimes simply delaying it. But I'd say for a small test chip, a new neural recording front end or something, the moment you have the idea what to do, I would say, roughly speaking, for an unexperienced engineer, it perhaps takes half a year to a year to design this thing, to make the blueprint, as I mentioned before. Then it takes you, depending on who the manufacturer is, another 4 to 6 months for the real manufacturing of the micro ASICs, and then you typically need another 1 to 2 months just for measuring. So a turnaround time of 1.5 years for a small chip, easy. Now it's the duty of the professor to have 4 or 5 PhD students, everyone doing some small chips, doing 1.5 years. And now I'm having all the blueprints for all the individual parts I need. And now I'm having perhaps another design team of 2 or 3 people to put the whole system together, right? But this is sometimes easier said as done because, like It's not that the money just comes around and everything fits together, but that's basically the trick to successively build up this expertise and these IP blocks, the libraries, what you talked about, such that at a certain moment you really can do larger systems. And once you have it, changing that has then a faster spin, like just taking the system and somebody coming around saying, wow, like, I don't know, the voltage compliance should be 2 volt higher or lower, piece of cake can be done, right? From that moment on, it's starting to be easy, but that's around the turnaround times, right? Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. So how does that work in academia, I guess? The professors, they make these chips and would they publish on the subcomponents as well? Like what you were saying, each of the PhD students are making, and then they would maybe publish on the full thing. And then when they make it, it's out in the public domain, or do they then make it for other people for free? Or because like you said, you could have the instructions, but it could still be missing things, or the know-how is not 100% there. So how does it work for, I guess, professors or academia?
So it's exactly as you said, like you first of all try to innovate on all pieces. Like when we talked before, let's just take that one example which we mentioned, like the neuromodulator. You need some recording, so data coming from neurons. You need some stimulation data going there. So you basically have these 2 pieces. Now you have, for example, artifacts. You have a stimulation artifact. So you have one person just working on how the heck basically can I get rid of stimulation artifact in the recording channel, because that's yet another piece of algorithm or hardware which you need. You need to digitize it somehow, right? So basically bring your data into the digital world. That's another one. Perhaps you have somebody to work on the compression algorithm, building a digital circuitry, which now basically brings the raw input recording data into some compressed form, right? Some neural network or whatever. You have somebody working on the data interface. You have somebody working on the power management and the wireless energy delivery. And now all of them basically innovate, publish, and if you're lucky, everything fits together if it's well planned. And at the end of the day, you can assemble a whole system at the end of the day. Sometimes you just don't have a good idea for a new power management or a good idea for a new communication. Now you just open up a paper from another group where you say, wow, that's good work. Let's just use it. And this is the boring part, because you don't win a prize with that by just reproducing other people's work. The only thing you can do is fail, right? Because if you succeed, you're just the 2nd or 100th person to do it. But then for the whole system, you still need that, right? Because, just with a little ASIC prototype of a neural recorder, nobody's going to even use that in an in vivo experiment, not even close to something living. So you really need to have a complete system in order to go there. And then, like you mentioned in your lab, like, my ASIC is useless for an actual experiment or for an implant if nobody's bringing that into a complete system, packaging it, bringing it into biocompatible environment and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's the flow where we have to go.
Yeah. And then you mentioned, I mean, you're involved in academia, of course, but you also, I guess, work with companies. Maybe you have your own company. So how does that work? I guess managing, IP from both sides, and then do the PhD students only work on one and not the other? And so I guess, what does your company look like too?
Good. So like we only have a little startup going on where we do consulting and IP generation, but actually not in the field of neurotech, but these data converters I was talking about, and that's like running very fine. But of course, academically, like the whole group collaborates with companies in different disciplines. Like we have our companies, where we work on data conversion, for example, for communication or radar. We have others where we work on hardware security. And of course, we have basically 1 or 2 companies in the last years, always where we talk basically a lot about the neurotech applications. And then typically, at a German university, the contracts are done like that. Who pays gets everything. Like, of course, it's always depending on the contract, but all IP which we generate within such a project really belongs to the company paying for the project. Always, of course, it is in the terms of the contract what you want to have. If there is, additional fees, or, if you have a patent or not, because IP is, like also the ASICs, and what can I do academically with that? Am I allowed to publish? Am I only allowed to publish after discussing with the company? What can I disclose, and so on? So it's very detailed. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's exactly as you're saying. And one more thing, like that's coming back a little bit to what you asked before. So when we build this IP and somebody sees it in a publication, that's the biggest problem. You simply can't go around and buy your next chip. Like these biochips are it's not a standard product which you just find around. So they have in the last, I would say 10 years, some of the larger design companies, without now saying some of the brands, have started to just take their portfolio and build some bioinstrumentation equipment. So where you basically can go buy stuff for some experiment might be okay. The moment when you really need again an ASIC, where you put these things together, you just can't call their hotline and say, can you put this piece, that piece, and that piece on one ASIC, and please add some telemetry and powering. They simply hang up the phone, right? And then again, you either found like you start a company yourself, like you just have a design team doing this for you, or you reach out to somebody like a university or some academic institution which is doing it for you.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's pretty incredible. And then is there any, I think in the US there's some like open source initiatives, put on by NIH and everything like this. So is there anything like that over there too, where like, I mean, what you were saying essentially, right? Like I don't know, some group submitted some, designs of something, and then you can choose, as a buyer, oh, I want this one, this one, this one. So there's nothing like that, like initiatives like this in Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I've been involved in several of those. It is actually amazing how much speed that has basically been taken in the last couple of years, because I was really under the impression, okay, software people only know open source, right? Like they share everything and so on. But then I thought by myself, and that's perhaps a rookie's thought, well, that's what they have to do, because I can copy software so easily, but copying hardware is not very easy, right? You basically buy a chip from some larger company and you look at it and you don't have a replicator, right? So just re-engineering it takes a huge amount of effort, large amounts of money, and then you just know how they built it. And now you basically still need to reproduce it. So you still need a design team. You only can perhaps see some of their tricks which they play. Long story cut short, I was a bit skeptical, but it's actually, it's taking up speed a lot. It could happen that in the future, there are more, how should I say, IP design sharing, open source hardware available. But still, there needs to be, how should I say, there needs to be a new payment model for it. Because honestly, even as an academic, I built something, am I now going to give it freely away? Not the idea, not the paper, not the results, but really all the hard work which I put in. Because before I said, when we come up with the next neuromodulator, we just basically use 75% of prior work. When I'm now giving that away, is that really helping myself? Here we go against society and selfishly proceeding in my own academic path. It's a very hard thing. And then again, we are not even commercial, right? If you're a commercial enterprise, I don't know, like, will a big automotive electronics company now just openly show all their sensor readouts, how they do it? I doubt that. So here we go. It's very an open question. And again, I was surprised how much speed it got over the last years. Stays interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So how many people in the world do this kind of work? I mean, both the design and the and the foundry as well. And I guess how many companies or how many people are there that are requesting this, and how is the Neurotech different than, other maybe biomedical implants or other types of ASICs?
Good. So how many groups are there around the world? I could not even count. Like when it's not as many as, like when you nowadays would say how many groups in the world are doing something with AI, say, all right, millions. It's not that much. But I'd say, in a country like Germany, I would say at the universities, ASIC design, perhaps 25, 30 in Germany. During Neurotech, a dozen, perhaps max. In Europe, now you scale that up. In the US, you scale that up. So it might be 1,000 groups really around the world just doing these things. For companies, that I would really say there are two kinds. It also, of course, depends on the size of the company. Some even small size companies simply decide we need a microelectronic design team because we need that stuff. I simply need an ASIC for my product. And I can't just rely on somebody doing it for me, because how can I force them to be my supplier for the rest of my product lifetime? So they simply know if I don't have that, I'm out of business, because I can't just say, okay, this guy did it until now, so tomorrow I basically get my chips from somewhere else. You have a 2 to 3 year gap in supply chain if you basically lose one supplier and you need to switch to another. If it is an ASIC, I mean an application-specific integrated circuit. So therefore, many companies, even on small size, invest high amounts of money in EDA software, in the engineers doing it, in order to not manufacture, but at least to develop their own chips, their own ASICs. And others simply supply themselves with collaborations, be it institutions, be it universities. But again, these ASICs you simply can't buy off the shelf, because that's why they are ASICs, right? You have a certain specification and somebody builds it right that way. Yep. So, and then, like, of course, the very large biotech companies, of course, they have their own design teams. They basically stuff themselves.
Yeah. So what would you recommend? This is a quite, as you said, unique path. If somebody's interested in this, like a student or something like this, how do they get into this? Do they have to be electrical engineers to be able to do this or understand this, or what's a good pathway?
You mean for a company to start this business of integrated circuits, or for a biotech or neurotech company to basically start this basically as a part of their business?
So I was saying more individual students, going through school, but actually that brings up interesting points as well. Yeah, if you could answer that too, like how does a company get into it?
So like you need to basically somehow study electrical engineering background. Like you can also be a biomedical engineer. If you like, biomedical engineer it's engineering plus bio, right? But what engineering? You can do mechanical engineering, I don't know, manufacturing technology engineering, whatever engineering plus bio. If it is electrical engineering plus bio, good to go, right? Because you simply need to have somehow the knowledge skills of a part of electrical engineering, because you don't need, power machinery or landlines or energy like power plants or stuff, but it's basically the electronic engineering part which you really need. And then, just a bachelor or master's degree, and then you can basically start it up. A big investment is really the tool set, like what you need to basically build your first integrated circuit. You need to have access to the technology, be able to manufacture overall. But there are, I'd say, semi-publicly sponsored institutions in the US. When I remember correctly, it was Moses. In Europe, it's Europe Practice, basically helping you, especially if you're an academic or a startup, to basically get access to that. But the prices are still high. So this EDA stuff is really expensive. Also there is, meanwhile, some open source initiative, both for EDA, but also for the design, as you mentioned before. So let's see where that's going. But up to now, it's really expensive stuff from few companies. There is only 3-4 main suppliers of this EDA software. And then the same is, of course, true for companies. That's why their first step would typically be, I get in contact with somebody who can do it. And then after some time, you basically see how it's working and you basically try to ramp up your own business in this direction. But then, you need to basically find this rare resource of, electrical engineer or electronic engineer doing it for you. Because if you basically hire now a rookie, not helpful, because you need to have a quick start. So again, the collaboration part is what I've seen in the past as basically the most often successful way to first basically start collaboration, get some knowledge, get something ramped up, and then somehow basically try in parallel to build up the own business. And then I don't want to say move out of the collaboration, but basically refocus into an in-house IC production. That's kind of working fine.
Okay.
No.
And at what stage should the company start doing this? I mean, you mentioned, it takes 4 months to design it and everything like this. Should they talk about, designs even before that, even a few years before that, if possible? Would you say as early as possible? And I guess, is that expensive too, or what does that look like?
I think it really depends on what application you're aiming for. Like if a company basically first wants to do some proof of concept, and you can do it with, breadboard, with PCB design electronics, do it, because it's going to be quicker, it's going to be cheaper. You get some expensive small prototypes, but it's by far, it's orders of magnitude cheaper than going for integrated circuits. If your company intends to do a retinal implant, there is no other way to say, okay, we need that ASIC from the first clinical trial on, but from the very first experiment on, we need it. And then you really reach out and you design and specify what you need. and you have to invest millions of euros in order to get your first chip, in fact, right? So I think it's really depending on that. Always don't touch integrated circuits if you don't have to, because it's expensive and it takes a long time. But when you really have to, you simply need to keep in mind that the design cycles are not months, but that they are really years. And therefore, as you say, like if you already know that your application is going that way, you reach out very early, because at the end of the day, an integrated circuit design can cost you, your whole business. Because if you have a 2-year gap where you simply can't do anything because you're waiting for somebody designing an ASIC for you, it's not a good idea for investors, most likely.
Yeah. And then actually, what does it look like in terms of money? Like, is this a case of, 9 pregnant women making a baby in a month? Could you, if you, let's say, 10x the money, could you make it go faster?
You can always make it faster. That was my example from before. Like with 1 or 2 PhD students, I need 5 years to build a neuromodulator or a neurostimulator. With 10 people, I basically was able to do it in a little bit more than 1.5 years. But you give me 100 people, it's not going to be done in 2 months, right? So like I typically say, there is a sweet spot where now you put in more people, and it's not going to accelerate it anymore, because like the whole communication, the whole administration business is starting to be too fine and too fine granularity. But just with 1 or 2 people, of course, it's taking way more time. So I would say a sweet spot for such a system is somehow around perhaps, I don't know, 4 to 6 people. Then you can really accelerate very much. And I would say a turnaround time in a year, meaning for the whole design process, a year is really something which is possible if you have some experienced designers around that. And then, of course, plus production. But then, yeah, again, we're still talking about 1.5 years, but not 5 to 10 or whatever, when you just do it with 1 PhD student always being a rookie for the first 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe absorbing more time than the giving back or something like this, or effort. Great. So if people want to reach out to you, I mean, I guess, are you open to work? If there's any neurotech companies listening, are you open to work with them? Or how should people reach out to you if they want to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, like we are or I'm in LinkedIn, and always, I can get in contact with people via email. That's happening, I don't want to say on a daily basis, but of course you basically get feedback on your work. And if there is somebody, also looking for, the chips which we already built, they are there. That's basically not the off-the-shelf supply, but there are basically pretty modular chips around. So if somebody is interested in that, just reach out by email, and I would be happy to get in contact.
Excellent. Maurits, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
Oh, I'm good. I would really talked about a lot of things to Elan. Like, I really enjoyed that talk.
Yeah, me too, actually. Like I said, this is the first one, and it's very similar to what I do, and I've been very curious about it. So this scratched my curiosity as well. So thank you.
Very good. Thanks a lot for the discussion.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.